We believe that conscious design includes places, spaces, and objects that have an awareness of and a responsibility towards people. The concept of conscious cities emerges from the manifesto, which advocates for the integration of technology and science-informed design in order to create a healthier and more inclusive and democratic built environment. I'm Madeline Hadley. I'm an architectural designer and a project lead at a science-informed design practice called HUME. And I'm involved with the Center for Conscious Design as the founder of the Toronto chapter of this festival and a Design for Wellbeing fellow. Here in Conscious Toronto, we've been zooming in on the role of conscious design to shape a more equitable city. We've spoken with experts in neuroscience, urban design, architecture, community organizing, and more about public space and housing and their role on health. And we've unpacked the experience of the post-COVID commute or lack thereof and how that's impacting us. In this afternoon's workshop, we're very lucky to have Antonio Gomez-Palacio and his team from DIALOG Toronto to facilitate a discussion around how evidence-based design can be used to strengthen the well-being of entire communities. Antonio's professional experience and research focuses on the intersection of architecture, planning, and urban design. He's internationally recognized for transforming cities into vibrant urban spaces that respond to their social, economic, and environmental contexts. Antonio's worked on a wide range of projects, and we're very happy to have him here today, looking at the Community Wellbeing framework from DIALOG, which helps to guide community conversations to meaningfully improve their well-being through the design of the work, planning of a neighborhood, construction of a building, and much more. I'll let Antonio take it away. And just a quick note that we are recording this session. So if you have any issues with that, please let me know in the chat. And otherwise, I hope we can all maybe introduce ourselves in the chat, and looking forward to meeting you all. So thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Start sharing my screen now. There we go. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. So yes, thank you for the introduction. My name's Antonio Gomez-Palacio, and you see on the screen the names of a handful of a couple of other people who will be helping out at different points today as facilitators, and they'll be introducing themselves as we go along. But I want to start this session on the concept of well-being by showing you a photograph of my great-grandmother. And partially because I just absolutely love this photograph. But this photograph was taken exactly 100 years ago. And why is that significant? It's because 100 years ago, if you do the, read the newspapers, we were in the middle of a world pandemic. So at that point, we were facing some of the issues that we're facing today. So that was her 100 years ago. That's my grandmother. That's my mom. And they all lived in Mexico City. My mom still lives in Mexico City. And this is Mexico City just in the middle of a pandemic. This is, they were also just in the middle of a revolution, but there was an incredible amount of things going on. This is the city of Toronto. This is where I live. This image was taken 100 years ago. This is the moment when we were also facing the middle of a pandemic. And if you would have lived 100 years ago, it was not just a pandemic. In fact, the 10 top causes of death at the time were all infectious diseases. In all likelihood, any one of us would have died from catching a bug of some sort. And in fact, today, if you were to die or I was to die, the top 10 causes of death are all chronic diseases. They're all things that we have to do with our day-to-day choices. If we exercise, what we eat, if we smoke or don't smoke, it all has to do with a lot in terms of lifestyle. So things have changed a lot in those 100 years. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to speak a little bit around broad concepts of community well-being, broad concepts around how we can address some of these elements. And then we're going to spend the bulk of the conversation today actually by breaking out into groups and having individual conversations that we can then come back. Because what we're trying to do is to figure out, yes, the world has changed in the last 100 years, but we want to collectively understand how and what we're going to do about it. So let's delve a little bit deeper. As of yesterday, in Canada, there's been almost 10,000 deaths of the coronavirus. 100 years ago in Canada, there was 55,000 deaths. So put this into a little bit of proportion. And then if you put it into further proportion, just looking at the deaths that have been emerged from cancer and heart disease, so both of those related to chronic diseases, there's over 250,000 deaths, and this is just per year. So we continue to need to be thinking about health and well-being in the broadest sense possible, even though we're going through the middle of a world pandemic. And in fact, if we just look at premature deaths, it is still the case that 60% of deaths have to do with behavior, with environment, with social circumstances. Only 40% have anything to do with genetics, and only of that 10% is the healthcare that you receive. The tragic thing in all of this is that 96% of our collective resources are spent on that 40%. We're only spending 4% of our resources on those things that are upstream, that have anything to do with influencing our behavior or lifestyle choices, on the things that matter in the broadest sense possible. And think about it. If I show you these two apples and ask, which one do you think contributes to your health and well-being? It's very obvious. You know exactly which is the apple that you would bite into in order to arrive at a healthy outcome. But if I do the same thing with these two environments and I say, okay, which of these two environments is the one that contributes to your health and well-being? Well, you kind of like to think it's the one on the left. And yet, for some reason, we continue to build the one on the right in every city in this planet. So why are we building cities of rotten apples? Why are we building environments that in fact are potentially not contributing to the health and well-being of ourselves, of our families, of our communities? There's something inherently broken in all of this. And of course, it's not just people, it's also the planet. You know, this is kind of where I am at, and I'm not sure where people are zooming in from, but we've now surpassed the point at which the planet is able to replenish itself by the amount of stuff that we consume. So we are now already doing a damage, as you all well know, well beyond what is sustainable. And of course, this is an issue that gets further and further compounded every year. World population has now surpassed the 6 billion, 7 billion, and we're already increasing on that mark. So it's an issue that is getting further and further pressure. And in fact, it's an issue that is most and increasingly an issue of cities. We've surpassed the point at which the majority of the world population now lives in cities. And therefore, this is really an issue that we need to face in terms of how we are creating human settlements. And pick any indicator that you like. Many of the issues are becoming compounded. So childhood obesity in almost every socioeconomic class. If we look not unrelated to the increase of global food prices, which is making food security worse and worse. Congestion in almost every urban environment is becoming more and more of an issue. And certainly if we look at the amount and the incidence of extreme weather events, it continues to increase. In fact, this is resulting in an inordinate amount of displacement of people, and most world refugees are environmental refugees, which is increasing year per year. So all of this leaves us in a scenario of, oh my God, the world is falling apart and I have no idea what I'm going to do. This sense of world transformation is so large that most people just disengage. And there's a cognitive dissonance that disassociates the problems from our ability to solve them. But my hope is that little individual, that smoker sitting in the corner. And I'll tell you why. Because We are facing a context right now where there's certainly going to be kind of a pre-vaccine and a post-vaccine world. And in the pre-vaccine world, everybody's mobilizing to try and figure out what we're doing in this instance. But the majority of the transformation of the built environment, of cities, of environments that we're developing in terms of how we're going to live, is in that post-vaccine world. And with smoking, there's a perfect example of where we've made a correlationship between a behavior and a health outcome. We've actually been able to isolate the variables of somebody lighting up and the health impact to themselves and to the people around them. The next area of research in this regard, of course, is sedentary behaviors. We've now been able to link a whole series of chronic diseases to a very specific behavior. And if this is all there was, then we wouldn't have to delve in any deeper. But we're really only scratching the surface on a whole series of things related to health and well-being. Think of mental health and social well-being and many of the other elements of your day-to-day life. And this is an issue that it doesn't only have an impact on individuals, it has a huge impact on all of us as a society. Just the cost of sedentary behavior in Canada is almost $10 billion onto the economy. This is 5% of the total healthcare budget. Imagine if we could just make small changes to people's behavior. We can start to make a huge impact and reallocate resources upstream. Health is 40% of provincials' budget, and this is getting larger and larger and larger every year. But of course, in how we plan cities, it's not the first time or the only time that we've actually related health to how we plan our environments. This is an image from the Charles Dickens era, where it was a moment when urban environments were associated with infectious diseases, yes, and pandemics and epidemics, but also pollution and contamination and kind of all the aspects of an emerging industrialized economy. And at that time, people fled to the suburbs, they fled to the Garden City, they fled and created other kinds of cities and aspirations of how we were going to start to address things. Cholera was dealt with by looking at water systems, and there was a huge transformation of cities based on ideas of health. If you look at organizations today from the World United Nations, they've created indicators around community well-being that are very much focused on trying to improve the health of people in terms of how we plan their environments. But these are often looking at incredibly vital but basic elements like access to clean water or access to sanitation. Cities like the city of Vancouver have created a vital signs report, which if you haven't seen it is extraordinary. It's really good. And they go out and they measure a series of elements in terms of how they're performing and how they're influencing health and well-being. But they're measuring things like, for example, voter turnout rate or high school dropout rates, which are incredibly important, but not something that many of us, in the design industries, architects, planners, interior designers, landscape architects, or community members thinking about their day-to-day life can actually influence. But these are really, really important. A couple of them that I really like is sense of belonging and some of the others. And of course, there's a number of projects that have embedded indicators around health and well-being. This is from Pearson Dogwood in Vancouver as well. And if you simply start to track the amount of publications and articles and projects that are tracking the relationship between health and the built environment, it continues to grow. So we're obviously in a moment in time when this is of a huge concern. And it's not just in the last 6 months. It's been over the last decade that this relationship has significantly increased. But as per my slides really at the beginning, we still inhabit this kind of cognitive dissonance. We inhabit a moment when the problems seem to be much larger than what we can actually appear to do. And we're still, as a society, as governments, as communities, we're investing in a very reactive mode. Once somebody is having a heart attack, not the 50 or 60 years before they have the heart attack. We need to start to get to a context when we're really thinking in a proactive way, helping people, helping communities, influencing behaviors, getting people to a better environment where they're sustaining health, not simply reacting to the symptoms of an unhealthy context. So that's the problem. That's the challenge that we face and we're trying to figure out. Personally, I'm part of DIALOG, and you see in the names of people that you're on the participants list, and a couple of people who have DIALOG in their name. As an organization, about 5 years ago, we tried to wrestle with the question of, why do we do this? Why do we get up in the morning? And what we concluded was this statement, that we're actually trying to meaningfully improve the well-being of communities. But the next morning, after we felt really good of writing this up, the next morning we realized, actually, we don't know what that means. What is well-being? How do we know that we're meaningfully improving it? How do we know that this is working or isn't? So at that point is when we realized there had to be a much better and deeper understanding brought into this conversation. So a big research project started. I was teaming up with the Conference Board of Canada and a number of different organizations, Laval University, the Center for Research around Disabilities, and municipalities, and a whole series of folks. It started by initiating a deep dive into the literature. So over 3,000 pieces of literature were investigated. And then in fact, a whole series of conversations and interviews and engagement took place with municipal officials and professionals and communities to really try and understand, how could we start to broach this question? And there was a couple of incredible insights that are already there and a lot of really good work, but there was also some gaps. There were some areas that clearly we needed to address in a deeper way. For us, there was a lot of information for chief medical officers and public health officials. Like, there was a lot in there, but there was very little to guide a community who's trying to design a park, right? Or a condo board or resident association that are trying to make their building and their community better, right? Or a tenant in an office space that is trying to create a better space for their employees, or designers or engineers. These folks had very little information and very little concrete information that would allow for that understanding. The other significant gap that we found was in scale. Census Canada collects a lot of information, but at a census-wide level, right? And many of the censuses in almost every country do it in an aggregated way in a fairly large scale. But there was very little that was available to really understand one building at a time, one neighborhood park at a time, one neighborhood plan at a time. And to do it in a way that you didn't have to wait 5 years for the next census or 10 years for the next census to come out. So we really needed to fill something up that allowed us to understand small interventions in a much more fast-moving kind of a way. The first 6 months of the entire research was simply spent on trying to figure out the definition. What does it mean? What does community well-being mean? And this was the definition that was adopted. And it's one that now a number of organizations and governments are adopting. You may have heard New Zealand adopted this definition, and now they evaluate every one of their federal projects in terms of how they contribute to community well-being. But there's a couple of really interesting things in this definition. You're all, of course, heard of the triple bottom line of sustainability that looks at social, economic, environmental. Sometimes they'll throw cultural in there, but you'll notice the word political in here. And that's a recognition that who participates in the conversation, who's sitting at the table, matters. And this is such an important point that it actually gets re-emphasized in the second part of the definition. Individuals and communities need to be part of the conversation. As soon as we adopted this definition, there was a watershed moment, because it implied that this was no longer going to be a fixed set of standards prescribing an outcome. In fact, it was going to start to become loose. It had to be organic. It had to be something that was going to be tailored by every community and adapted and used in a different way in every community, in a way that really incorporated their understanding, their thinking, and what was going to be essential for them to flourish. So we had a definition. We had 5 domains. The next step was, of course, to start to unpack these domains into a series of indicators that really allowed us to understand how we were going to approach this. And of course, through the literature, we had this crazy massive Excel chart with over 1,000 different potential indicators. But if we were to tell a community, go out and measure 1,000 things, it was never going to happen. So it boiled down to those 18 indicators and a series of metrics that allowed us to get a better understanding of how we were going to be able to design and do things in a way that contributed to health and well-being. So these indicators are the ones that I'm going to walk through, each one of them, but also that we're hoping that when we break out into groups, you will be picking up and addressing individually. Part of the research entailed doing some case studies, looking at some projects, some sites, and trying to understand how those allowed us to better understand the contribution to health and well-being. This was a civic building, the regional police headquarters in an interstitial small little community that really kind of allowed us to think about it in different ways. But I'll use it as a backdrop to talk about the social domain. The first indicator under the social domain is welcoming. Think about it. You know, if an environment is not welcoming to everybody, regardless of background or physical ability or cultural references, if it's not welcoming to people, it's not going to be able to contribute to the health and well-being of the community. So this is a question that we need to be asking right at the outset of every project. Who is going to be using this space? Who is going to be accessing? How is it going to be happening? And what are the conditions that we need to establish for it to be truly welcoming? The second indicator is support systems. What do people need in order to undertake their activities of everyday life? Maybe it's childcare. Maybe it's access to healthy food. Maybe it's access to health facilities or to outdoors. These will vary on a site by site, on a context, on a community by community. But again, we need to be asking this question right at the beginning, because it's going to be very hard to achieve it if we're asking the question at the end or not at all. But if we do it right at the outset, there's a greater likelihood that we'll be able to satisfy the things that people need on a day-to-day basis to be able to achieve their functions. The third indicator, socialization. And of course, we all know that socialization is important for us. We're certainly seeing it these days through the pandemic in terms of balancing the needs of social distancing and staying at home versus the needs of mental health, of being able to engage with others. But I had no idea how important this is. We can push off early onset dementia. We can have a significant impact on increasing the quality of life in terms of extending quality of life for people by simply increasing in the provision of spaces of socialization, both indoors and outdoors. So this has to become a driving force in many of the things that we do in terms of how we build our environments. The second domain is the environmental domain. And this is another case study in the city of this is in Saskatoon, where we looked at a residential project, and I'll use it as a backdrop for the environmental domain. The first indicator is delight and enjoyment. And clearly, if people don't enjoy their environments, if people don't find pleasure in their environments, it's not going to contribute to their well-being, to their mental health, or anything else. So I'll give you a sense of some of the metrics in here. Views to nature. We know that that can significantly increase mental health, but also sunlight, natural ventilation, an enjoyment of the environments in which you are at. Second indicator, of course, the health of natural systems themselves. We know that if we're inhabiting environments where natural systems are behaving and are in a healthy way, that it very directly contributes to our health and well-being. So the health of water, energy, air, greenhouse gas, carbon, all of these things are become important metrics. Third one is mobility. And the two things that are being tracked here are reduced car dependency and increased active transportation. Because we know both of those things have a significant impact on creating environments where our behaviors are conducive to health. And I mentioned the sedentary behaviors at the beginning. This is the one that really focuses on that. And it's really important, but it's not all the story. There's many other aspects that we need to round it out. The fourth indicator here is resilience. And of course, many people, when I say resilience, think about climate change and climate adaptation and floods, and that's a really important part. But resilience more broadly is about all things of how we can adapt to change. And I'll give you an example. Aging. We're all aging, as far as I know, but often is we haven't thought about environments to be able to age in place, to be able to adapt to our own bodies as they continue to evolve. So we need to be able to think about the changes that we're facing as individuals, as families, as communities, be it physical changes or economic, demographic, technological changes, and how are we going to be able to adapt to those. Third domain is the economic domain. I think somebody might not be on mute. If you can place yourself on mute, it would be great. The third one is the economic domain. And the first indicator here is affordability. And many of us think, a housing affordability, but this is really about all aspects of your lifestyle. So think about in Canada, the average income allows for 17% of disposable income to be invested in housing throughout people's lives. But 14% of income gets spent on transportation. So if we just enable people to live in environments where they do not need to purchase a car, we've liberated 14% of income. Imagine what that can do to somebody's household. So we need to be thinking about affordable mobility, affordable access to health, affordable access to recreation, to education. There's many other aspects that become part and parcel of us thinking, how do we support the health and well-being of the community? Because we know that income is one of those social determinants of health that has a huge impact. Second one is complete communities. And this is the idea that scale matters. If we're able to do all of these things within walking distance, if I can go and get those dozen eggs or a loaf of bread within walking distance, or get to work or to school, all of these kinds of things, it makes a big difference versus having to drive long distances and get into a car in order to do that. And if scale matters, time also matters. We need to be thinking about the full life cycle of things. How does this look in 5, 10, 40, 50 years? I need to be looking at the production, the construction, the operations, and even the disposal of things. How is this setting up the context for it to be economic in the fullness of time? And the last indicator here is local economy, because we know that if we spend a dollar here, and that dollar can spin through the local economy a couple of times, we're actually going to be making a significant and positive impact on the community. So am I creating opportunities for local entrepreneurialism, for local businesses, hiring local talent, using local resources? Am I doing things that are going to enable the local economy to thrive? The fourth domain is the cultural domain. And this project is a big LRT, a light rail transit project in the city of Edmonton. But it was also looking at trying to understand how the impact of this was being. The first indicator there is cultural and recreational vitality. And this is not just about access to galleries or a big stadium or big types of events, but think about people having access to their culture and to each other's culture. And I'll give you an example. I was once sitting or standing in the middle of a university in a city with an indigenous student, and they had lived there their entire lives. But they told me when they were looking around that in what they could see and in what they could show me, there was nothing that reflected their culture, that they always felt out of place in the city where they had lived their entire lives. This to me is tragic, right? It means that there's a disassociation with an access and an ability to engage at a cultural level with your own environment. And this is incredibly critical because it speaks to that next indicator, which is a sense of belonging, which is an ability to be able to feel like you're part of it. And if you remember from the vital signs report from the city of Vancouver, that's one of the indicators that they measured. They actually go out and ask people, how's our sense of belonging doing at a citywide level? So some of the metrics that are measured here are rates of volunteerism. Do you know your neighbors? Because we know that if we're able to really create environments where people can feel a sense of belonging, we're going to build that social capital, those social bonds that are going to allow people to be more resilient, to be able to adapt better, to be able to engage each other and support their mental health and their social well-being. The third indicator here is one that I love, and the literature is significantly increasing in how play, and not just kids, but all of us, our ability to engage creatively with our environments has a huge impact on our well-being. And the fourth indicator here is learning. Because of course, if I just go around wagging my finger and say, you know, they shall engage in active lifestyles, and nobody understands why, it's never going to happen. But if people really kind of have the ability to understand and relate to why we're doing this, it makes a huge difference. So we need to be able to build the capacity with communities, with each other, around how this is actually contributing to well-being and what are we going to do about it. The fifth domain is the political domain. And yes, I love this photograph because we were engaging on a project, and Batman and the Joker came by and stopped taking photographs with tourists and to engage in our panels. But this is a really important one because some of the indicators here are, did we actually have an integrated process where all the different voices that need to participated through the process? Or did they only show up, or did we only call them up at the very tail end of the process? And were there in fact opportunities for them to collaborate in a way that their input was felt to be a safe environment and to be meaningful input into it? Are we creating truly environments where people can collaborate? Because this is key to that last indicator, which is establishing a sense of ownership and stewardship within the community. And think about it. You know, in our prison system, we've decided that one way for us to penalize people is to actually take away the ability to change their environments, to do things in their space. At home, of course, I can do that. I can paint a wall, I can hang a picture, I can do all kinds of things. But now think about how we treat city streets or parks or civic buildings. We don't allow anybody to actually take a stewardship role over these environments. We treat most of our urban spaces in the same way that we treat our prisons. We take away the ability for people to actually have a meaningful contribution over the majority of the cities that they inhabit. There's something weird here. We need to be thinking about it the other way. How can we create environments where people can actually take a strong sense of stewardship and ownership? So anyway, this leaves probably most of you with thinking, okay, that sounds great, maybe, but I don't know what the hell do I do with all of that, right? What do I start to do with these indicators? Frankly, for ourselves, we've just started to run out and start to engage community, start to talk to people, start to engage folks and ask the questions, much the same way as we will do today. Is how does this allow us to start to think about your space, your neighborhood, your community, your work, your day-to-day life in a different way? So in this case, it was in the city of Kingston. We were asking about a big neighborhood plan. And literally communities started to fill out, every one of these indicators. How did they start to think about? And it resulted in a transformed plan of how we could start to evolve and think about the vision and the way in which the community would move forward. Or on a slightly smaller scale, this was in the city of Ottawa. This is now a small neighborhood, about 5,000 residential units coming together, building parks, thinking about it, using these kinds of tools to completely change the conversation. So whereas before the conversation would have been entirely around traffic and how tall is the building, now it could be about creating opportunities for volunteering. It could be about spaces of socialization, about thinking about how we could create environments that are truly welcoming. And it resulted in a very different way of us understanding the project. Or the city of Vancouver, 2 community colleges that, when they really started to think about it, turned themselves around and broke down the walls of many of their environments around it to completely relate to the community and start to restitch a broader sense of well-being. And as an individual building, right? This is in Toronto. How could we start to think about just one site? And of course, now in the pandemic era, how do we have these conversations online, and how do we engage them in a way that we're truly having them in a meaningful way? But I do want to end the presentation where I started, with a photograph, my great-grandmother, my grandma, my mom, and this is a photo of me pre-pandemic beard. But more importantly, this is my kid. So we need to not be thinking about how we were designing cities for 100 years ago, and frankly, not how we're designing environments for today. We need to be thinking about what are the environments that we're creating for the next 100 years, and how are we going to be doing that, and how are we going to start to build and develop and think about the next generation. So if anybody is interested, the whole research and all of those elements are on that website. And it's a big report you can download. There's a compendium report that people can also download. I'll put it in the chat in a little moment. If you want to just copy it, it's all available there for anybody to use.